I'd like to start this session by introducing my co-chair, Dr. Amy O'Hearn from the University of Cambridge, and I'm Jason Halford, and we are co-chairs of the Psychology, Behaviour and Mental Health Working Group, one of the newest working groups of the ASO. And Amy's going to tell you a little bit more about the working group, our purpose and our function, but also importantly, how you can interact with this. Okay, so we're working groups and we have projects and we will recruit people to those projects, people who are able to commit to them. So I'll hand over with no further ado to Dr. O'Hearn.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you all for coming today. So we know that obesity is caused by a complex interplay of biological, psychological, social, environmental and economic factors, and that the prevention and treatment of those is going to be multifactorial. But at the heart of any approach to prevention and treatment of obesity is this critical issue of psychology and behaviour change. And behavioural techniques and psychological support are going to be critical to any effective approach. And these should be underpinned by scientific evidence and research, but also by clinical expertise and the expertise and experience of people living with obesity. And the aim of this working group is to bring together people with these expertise from across Europe to collaborate in sharing knowledge and also driving advancement of the field. One of the areas we want to focus on over the next few years is the association between obesity and mental health. This association is complex and often overlooked in favour of the effect of obesity on physical health. We know that obesity is heavily stigmatised and that stigma has a significant detrimental impact on the mental well-being of people living with obesity. And we also know that mental illnesses are actually more common in people with obesity, and that patients with mental illness are more likely to have higher rates of obesity and the associated physical illnesses that come with that. We know that mental health issues can promote weight gain, as can some of the treatments for more severe mental illnesses. They also act as barriers to accessing vital obesity treatment. On average, we find that obesity treatment has small positive effects on mental health, but there are some people receiving obesity treatment who experience a worsening of mental health during that treatment. So we know that we need to improve the mental health support for people living with obesity. And there are examples of good practice across Europe and beyond, particularly in specialist clinical settings. But the scale of obesity across Europe means that most obesity treatment isn't happening in clinical settings. And we need to identify ways to break the disconnect between what's happening in specialist facilities and what can happen at scale in a healthcare system. And so there's a pressing need for us to identify what are the best buys that we can afford to deliver at scale and developing new high-value, low-cost interventions to support mental health and well-being. So the aim of this working group is to convene the ASO faculty, external experts and patient representatives who focus, be that in research, practice or advocacy, on the assessment, treatment and promotion of psychological and mental health issues in obesity. Our objectives are to inform science and policy in areas of psychology and mental health in obesity and drive an agenda for change, to work with people living with obesity to investigate psychological issues around the lived experience and to articulate mental health needs across scientific and clinical communities, to engage the behavioural science and practitioner communities to develop an interactive approach, to share and disseminate best practice and innovation, and to act as a network to test and compare interventions. We want to develop education and training materials, including guidance on psychologically supported communications for different groups of healthcare professionals. and provide capacity building opportunities for both experienced and established researchers, practitioners and policymakers, and those in their early career, so that we can strengthen the skills of those working in the areas of mental health and psychology. In terms of what you can do to support that effort, if you are interested in being involved in the work of the working group, please do email me to talk about that interest. But also, we'd like you to start by helping us to set the priorities for this working group. And we'd like you to use your phones to respond to this poll. You can see the link here to the question, what do you think is the biggest priority in supporting the mental health of people living with obesity? And we'd like you to answer that while the session's going on, and we may discuss findings at the end with the rest of the questions. But first, I'd like to introduce today's symposium, which focuses on a particular area that we have identified as a priority, which is the co-occurrence of obesity with emotional and disordered eating. Similar to how we talked about the general association between mental health and obesity, the prevalence of eating disorders and sort of subclinical disordered eating is higher in people living with obesity. And yet there are no clinical practice guidelines about how to screen, assess and monitor eating disorder risk within the context of obesity treatment. And importantly, there are limited options for effective treatment. Indeed, having an eating disorder often is a barrier to receiving obesity treatment that could be quite critical for people, but also having a higher BMI limits the options available for you for receiving eating disorder treatment. So addressing this critical need is going to require greater international collaboration between experts in obesity disorders. And this symposium brings together that expertise. So organised by Jordan Marwood and Louisa Ells, they brought together researchers, practitioners and people with lived experience to talk about this important area. And so first of all, we're going to start with Jordan Marwood, who is a research fellow at the Obesity Institute and organised this symposium. And she's going to be talking about her work on disordered eating and obesity.
So yeah, I've got the great pleasure of kicking off this meeting today. Thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to be discussing some of the work that we've done so far in the Obesity Institute. So we understand obviously that emotional and disordered eating are huge issues for people living with obesity. Specifically, we have received a huge amount of requests from our PPIE group members. We work closely with Obesity UK and with various other advocacy and patient groups. And while the research, as we can see on the screen, tells us, that as Amy said, people living with obesity have higher rates of disordered eating and emotional eating, we know that these are huge issues in and of themselves because of the voice of lived experience, which is critical to all of the work that we do in the Obesity Institute. So I'm going to discuss some of the work that we've done, that we're going to do, and then also I'm going to introduce the wonderful Ken and Susie, who are going to talk about their lived experience. So we first sort of kicked off this programme of work with a piece of work that was commissioned by OHID. And within this work, we surveyed commissioners, practitioners and service users of Tier 2 weight management services to see the extent to which mental health and psychological support was embedded within Tier 2 services. Generally, we found it is not. And I think that that's not a surprise to most people in this room. However, we also did a thematic analysis of the patient responses, Tier 2 weight management service users. And the things that they highlighted for us were, although this is not currently being offered, it is really needed. There's an interplay between weight management and mental health, and also that a lot of people express their eating behaviours in terms of addictive and disordered eating. We also submitted a quite substantial grant application to a call from the UKRI for eating disorder expansion and collaboration. Unfortunately, we weren't successful within that, but we did secure some small CRM funds to develop some PKI work as support to support this application. And these were live scribed by a company called Nifty Box, and they really highlight the impact that emotional and disordered eating has on people living with obesity. So I'd just like to share a couple of those images now. And I've highlighted a couple of the most important areas. So people were really keen to point out that there's a need to join up lots of different areas. People like men are really discounted, especially when it comes to emotional and disordered eating. And also people fall through the gaps because they're not able to access disordered eating support within weight management care, and they're also not able to access weight management support within disordered eating care. We will be sharing these images via our Twitter pages as well. It's also really important that we incorporate the views of lived experience, and people with lived experience reiterated that to us. And they also reiterated that there is a prioritisation of anorexia and bulimia within eating disorder care, which is often to the detriment of other forms of disordered eating behaviour that are more common in people living with obesity, such as binge eating disorder and avoidant restrictive feeding disorder. We've also got some ongoing work in this area, so we are doing an evaluation of an emotional eating pilot, which is being delivered by a weight management provider in the UK. We're doing some really interesting longitudinal work looking at emotional eating within a cohort of young people across the UK and in Australia, in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And we have a fantastic PhD student, Dawn, who is here with us today, who is going to be exploring effective interventions for emotional eating. We're also trying to continue our work in this area, given the fact that we have had repeated requests for this work from people with lived experience. So we work very closely with Obesity UK, and we're hopefully going to be piloting some specific support groups for people living with emotional and disordered eating. We have a good relationship with Beat, the Eating Disorder Charity, and we're hoping to survey some weight management providers to see the extent to which they're screening for binge eating disorder specifically within their services. And then I think, for me, the most important piece of work that we're doing as one of our next steps is exploring barriers and facilitators to shared working between the weight management and the eating disorder fields, because it really is the elephant in the room. We're all here because we know that these things are important, that these two fields need to work together, but at the moment they really don't. And how can we cross the aisle, as it were, and try to bring those groups together? And given all of this, we have just launched a new coalition, the Obesity and Disordered Eating Coalition. We're on Twitter, please find us, follow us and find us. And we're just trying to bring together a sort of coalition of like-minded people with experience, practitioners, researchers, to try to, as I said, bring people together to explore these areas in more detail. So I have got the great pleasure of introducing Susie Burney. Susie is from Dublin. She has lived with obesity for most of her life, and after weight loss surgery, is really passionate advocate for people living with disordered eating. Susie has ARFID, which I'm sure she'll be talking about. So over to you, Susie. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. First of all, I have to say I'm going to keep saying this. I'm delighted to be here in Dublin. So welcome. We're here at Congress, and you're going to see a lot of slides. You're going to hear a lot of facts. There's a lot of science, and I'm here with a lot of people here to bring feelings. So I'm not sharing any slides. I don't think I need to share slides. A lot of you will understand already what ARFID may be, so I don't need to go into a full description of it, but just more so in how it relates to me and how it affected my life. So from at the age of 2, my mother saw that I had problems with food. I wouldn't eat like everybody else in the family. ARFID is avoidance restrictive food intake disorder, but quite often people understand as selective eating disorder. But from a child, the words I heard all the time was I was fussy. I was a picky eater, and that I was choosing to be this way. We didn't understand it, but it did cause a lot of tension in our family because it was the phrase that you will have heard that you're sitting at that table till you eat your dinner. Well, I did, and I sat there till 8 o'clock at night, and it was a battle of wills between my mother and myself, and who was going to win this battle because she thought I was choosing it. But I could not eat the food that was put in front of me. So my outfit is based that it is texture, taste, smell. It's all of the senses around food. So I would look at something and just say, I can't eat that. Not I don't want to, I can't. And there are certain levels, and it's very hard to describe it, but it's almost like a fear of food. So if certain foods were put in front of me, I will actually take a step back away from it. And there are certain foods that when other people are eating them, I have to actually walk away because I feel ill just smelling it or seeing them eating it. So it is quite complex. But when you're a child dealing with this and you don't understand it, it's even worse because you go to a kid's party and there's nothing there you can eat. And you're trying to explain, I can't eat that. And the mother is getting worried because you're there for 3 hours in the afternoon and you're not having something to eat. And I'm like, I can't. It's really difficult. So you have this high anxiety every time you go somewhere. So I stopped going places, even as a child. I wouldn't go to a friend's party. I wouldn't go to, gatherings. But the hardest bit, I suppose what I could sum it up as is that it was the start of when I wasn't feeling normal in society. At age 10, you want to feel normal, but you would hear words like my uncle would say, we'd go over to my aunt's house, they would have tandoori chicken, rice, food that I can't eat. So my mother would bring a plain chicken fillet for me to eat, which was fine. I was fine with that. She was fine with that. They weren't fine with that. They couldn't understand that. And I was like, why do you have to be so awkward? Can you not just eat normally like everybody else? Can you not just be normal? I'm 10, and that started the anxiety, self-loathing, it's my fault, and all the complex feelings and emotions that come with that, having a food disorder. I didn't talk about it much as I got to my teens and older because I felt that people would think I was making excuses for that's why I was gaining weight. My disorder was quite complex in that on a sort of a phase, I would call it, a bad phase, what I was doing was I would eat bread. I would have 4 slices of bread at 7 in the morning, 11, 3, and 8 at night. There'd be ham on one, cheese on the other, I'd never mix them. If I was getting cheese, if the use by date or sell by date was 2 days away, I would eat it. In my mind, the word comes contaminated. It's contaminated. If I did eat it, I'm probably having such a high level of anxiety about it that I will make myself sick. But then I'm saying, yeah, see, it was contaminated. So I'm in this vicious circle. So I would do that for maybe 5 days in a row. I would only have bread every single day for maybe 5 days. And then it's almost like I'd switch out and I go back to have my eggs and my chicken and my milk and my cheese, very much dairy for me. But I can't eat sauces. I have never eaten a vegetable ever in my life. No hot drinks. I don't tend to have food touching too much on a plate, depending on what it is. And I would nearly always eat food in the same order. Trying to hide that when you're in a group of people is quite difficult. So as I say, I stopped going a lot of places. Treatments. I tried cognitive behavioral therapy, neuro-linguistic therapy, hypnotherapy. I went to eating disorder clinics, but they all focused just on anorexia and bulimia. So I didn't know where to go. Literally, I spent thousands on like neuro-linguistic therapy, and it wasn't really known. And I spent thousands trying to fix the problem. Because I really did believe it was the problem for my obesity. And if I fixed that, I was going to be fine. I didn't understand at the time that obesity is more complex than that, and that I actually have more reasons than my food disorder for my obesity. But going into each treatment, and anybody who knows me knows I focus on certain words, and words are really important for me. Expectations. So expectations of going into every single treatment were so high that this was going to be the fix. When it didn't work, the devastation afterwards, the feeling of failure. The feeling it was my fault that this didn't work. So that was quite hard. We hear the term living with obesity, and maybe some people don't really get what that means. It's not just about not saying obese people. We live with obesity, but what that means is it's every single day that you get up. You have to live with obesity in whatever way, shape, or form that is for you. Well, this is probably the first time I'm going to say this. I live with ARFID, but I also live with type 2 diabetes. I live with polycystic ovarian syndrome. I've only recently found out I live with lipodema, and I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll stop. But that is, obesity is a chronic relapsing disease, and my ARFID was only one fraction of that. But the correlation of it was the hiding away, the not understanding it, feeling it was my fault, not looking for help for it, and not feeling that I was progressing anywhere with it. I think really to sum it up, it was the day that I stopped trying to fix it was the day it got better. Instead of fighting it, battling it, struggling with it, all combative words, I accepted it. So this is me. So what will I do best? I will learn how to adapt to this. So I'm here at the Congress today, and in my bag back in our room, I have crackers and cheese because there's not anything on the menu here that I can eat. When I go to an event, I ring in advance and I say, can I have something plain? And generally it's not too bad. But I did face one Congress I was at and I went down, and I can be known as the chicken lady, whereas the chicken lady was just having some different. I'm having my plain chicken, and they brought me down full cooked chicken and a knife and fork, and I'm like, they hadn't even carved it. I'm like, am I supposed to eat off this? And that's where I'm catapulted straight back to the emotional feelings of this is embarrassing, because people start asking me questions. I was at my very first Congress in Porto. Never went anywhere before because of the fear of the food. And the dinner came out and I knew I wouldn't have it, but I had crackers in my bag and I was fine. But somebody else said, no, go and get her another dinner. She needs it cooked this way. So the waiter came out again and he slammed the plate down in front of me. The people at the other side of the table said, what's wrong with it now? What's wrong with you now? And I got up, I jumped up, my chair banged back behind me and I ran to the bathroom crying because I was back there again, the shame. Why do I have to be so, this is embarrassing. If I don't care about it, why do other people have to care about it? Don't talk about it. And that is actually the same with obesity. Everybody feels they can talk about your obesity. They don't come up and ask you, how's your HbA1c today? But they will say, what size clothes you're wearing, your weight is dropping off you. And it's really difficult when people feel that they can talk about you like that and you're dealing with the emotional side of it. It is really quite difficult. So yes, acceptance is the big word for me. I learned to adapt, I learned to cope, I learned to live with the conditions I have, whether it's heart or obesity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie, that was fantastic. I have now got the very great pleasure of introducing Ken Clare. We've worked very closely with Obesity UK, and Ken is one of the, I'm going to get your job title wrong now, you're going to have to correct me. One of the chairs of Obesity UK. Ken has lived with obesity all of his life and is a passionate patient advocate. Ken Clare.
And thanks for inviting me to speak. Thanks for that talk, Susie. It was really moving and it's always difficult to follow. So, just a bit of background about Obesity UK. We have 30,000 members who are supported by a variety of means through Facebook, through Zoom, and through face-to-face meetings. This whole discussion is difficult. People don't want to talk about it. As soon as you mention the word eating, obesity, disorders, and addiction in any sentence, people clamour generally. And I've never found it easy to start that discussion. So I think it's underreported tremendously. I think that some people living with obesity have stigmatised views of eating disorder services. I did. I went to them, and it was what I expected, a service for younger, and there was only ever women I saw in the waiting room, people with the what I call traditional eating disorders. And many weight management services use those same services or to give psychological support. I found that reframing the question is the main thing. Talk about food and mood. Talk about how you use food and mood to shift how you're feeling about yourself. About anxiety, about stress, about loneliness, about anger, about all the emotions, about negative self-image. What our plea for this morning is for a compassionate approach to find a way through this, because that's what we need. We can beat ourselves up, and many primary care physicians in the past have done that with us, so we need support, and I think this new working group is an excellent way to do that. We need to look out for least heard communities, people from the LGBTQ plus community and from the minority ethnic groups. And I want to make a special thought, it was on the sheet, about men. I've been around 20 years as a patient, as a nurse, in specialist weight management, and the men aren't there. And the men don't talk about this. But what I've found, I live with this, I live with disorder and emotional eating. So, and when I talk about it, about me, people open up. And that, I think, is one of the ways forward. So I think this is a fantastic start to a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Can I just remind people, if you're at the back, if you can filter through, there are still some space for the people can move along a bit. That would be great to let people at the back in. I'm now delighted to welcome Professor Tracy Burrows, who's Associate Professor of Nutrition and Dietetics at the University of Newcastle. And Tracy's going to be talking about improving social narrative around the role of emotional and disordered eating in adults living with obesity. And Tracy's going to be presenting this remotely, so she'll appear in front of us shortly. Hopefully. Yeah.
The title of my presentation today is the role of emotional, disordered and addictive eating in adults living with obesity, improving the social narrative. To start my presentation today, I'd really like to just consider the many factors that can contribute to an individual's weight status. These could be considered under a range of different lenses, whether they're individual factors or more macro factors in the environment in which we find ourselves in. But today I'll focus more on those individual factors contributing to an individual's weight status. So move to the next slide. So traditionally, when we consider health behaviours at the individual levels that impact on an individual's weight status, traditionally we may think of dietary intake, physical activity, and increasingly we've seen research or treatment programs or management programs incorporating the idea of sleep and that impacting on someone's weight status. But these don't occur in isolation, and increasingly so, there are a range of different health behaviours that can impact on an individual's weight status. So the ones that I've added to the slide include smoking status, and they also include alcohol and substance use consumption. And when we all come to today's presentation, we all bring our own expertise, and we may bring our own expertise to the topic. So my background is in dietetics, and so I can talk a little bit more about dietary intake, but I'm sure there's other people here today coming to us from a range of different backgrounds. And so when we think about these individual factors, we're all aware of these, but when we know when it comes to assessing some of these factors, some of these things that look pretty straightforward become complex very fast. So for example, when we think of dietary intake, it's not just simply about the choice of foods in which we're making. It could be their overall dietary pattern, but it could also include eating behaviours, which we're going to focus on a little bit in today's presentation. But equally so, all of these health behaviours come with a range of different factors that can be assessed and all contribute to perhaps an individual's weight status that we need to factor in and consider. We do know these health behaviours, they don't occur in isolation. They often co-occur together. So someone, for example, may have poor dietary intake, but this may also have an influence on their physical activity levels, but it might also impact on their sleep behaviours. And so it's a really complex relationship that exists between all of these health behaviours, and increasingly should be considered when we're thinking about factors that contribute to an individual's weight status when we're thinking of management. So when we're focusing on dietary intake, very traditionally from a dietitian's perspective, we may think about the type of food, or the individuals who have tried to change their dietary intake often focus on what foods am I having, what can I swap them out with, what drinks am I having, what better choice would I actually make? And there is a really big focus on that. But increasingly so in research and in some clinical practice, and a lot of our research that we do at the University of Newcastle, we've started to focus in on why people eat in particular ways. And by focusing in on the why, it has an influence on the type of food that we're actually choosing. So really, we're thinking about this social narrative and increasingly so these eating behaviours or why we eat in particular ways in which we do. So when we talk about the why, what kinds of things are we talking about? Well, it could include things such as emotional eating, a common term that we see in context of weight management. Many of us have heard of this before. It could be the why we eat particular foods. It could be eating in response to a particular mood or a particular state of mind. So it could be depression, it could be anxiety. So, someone feeling pretty down and turning towards particular foods because it makes them feel more comfortable, or perhaps someone's feeling quite anxious, and to curb those anxious thoughts, maybe food provides a solution for that. So unless we think about these things in the context of our management or our treatment options, or when we're talking to someone about improving their relationship with food or improving their dietary intake, we need to consider the why people eat. It could be stress-related eating. It could be a particular time of day. Maybe it's the afternoon that's a common thing for many people. That 3:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon, being awake for a while. Lots of people turn to snacking, and perhaps maybe it's that time of day. Or perhaps it's late in the evening when people are trying to wind down after a hard day at work, and it's a particular time of day that they associate with eating a particular type of food. For example, chocolate in the evening, or eating something in response to sport, perhaps on a TV on a weekend afternoon. Or in fact, it could be a particular type of food that drives someone to eat in a particular way. So perhaps eating something really fast, or perhaps eating something really crunchy, those types of things. So we need to focus in on that why. And I'm going to focus in a little bit more on addictive eating in a few slides' time. But I thought I'd just touch on really the thing that I'd like you to be considering in today's presentation is really uncovering this in between. So what we find when it comes to health-related conditions or chronic health conditions, people often try to treat things or manage things in isolation. But what we're seeing increasingly is starting to look at that in between, or that grey area. So traditionally, someone might think about weight management options. Their treatment might focus in just on the weight management. Or if someone has some kind of disordered eating or mental health condition, they may be treated for that particular condition. But we know that they actually all interact, and it's really about this grey area in between. So when we think about emotional eating or addictive eating, or some types of disordered eating that don't quite meet that diagnostic threshold, all of these things contribute to perhaps an individual's weight status. And we need to be talking about these with our clients and with our consumers to get a better understanding about what their goals are and really personalised care. Then we're focusing a little bit on addictive eating, because that's something that our research group in the University of Newcastle has a strength in. And it does have a social narrative around it, both for the consumer and a range of different health professionals, and I'll provide a little bit of a snapshot of that for you. So when we talk about addictive eating, there is no current accepted definition, but often when you look at these as a collective, it's really a compulsive overeating behaviour that people have towards particular foods, or it could be foods in general, but it impacts on someone's day-to-day functioning. So it could be accompanied by a sort of sense of losing control, but it could also be consumed and there'd be an inability to change that particular behaviour. So it sort of sits in that addictive like behaviours. We know when we look at research that it often occurs in individuals with a higher weight status, but not always the case. It can occur in those with a healthy weight status as well. We see it overlapping with other mental health conditions, particularly binge eating disorder, but also with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And we also see it co-occurring with other health conditions as well. So when we think about the social context of addictive eating, many people have heard of this term before. Lots of our qualitative research in people across the lifespan, whether that be children, adolescents, or adults, many people have heard or they have an increasing acceptability of this term. So when we look at the international research, at any one particular time, 47% of the population actually self-perceive themselves to have some type of food addiction. So this probably is unsurprising to all of you, because I'm sure we've all at some stage reflected on our own eating behaviours, whether we've talked about whether we've been a chocoholic or a carb craver, or a chippy chomper, people caffeine addicts, addicted to coffee or tea to get us through the workday. We've all self-proclaimed our own. And at any one particular time, 86% of the population, which is quite considerable, believe that certain foods actually have addictive potential. So it would probably be also unsurprising that most often those foods are those high energy dense, nutrient poor foods such as takeaway or junk foods that most often have that belief that they have addictive potential. So food addiction isn't recognised in our diagnostic statistics manual. So it's not actually a diagnosable condition from a medical sense. And how it's usually assessed is usually self-report tools. Now, there's a range of different self-report tools that can be used to assess addictive eating behaviours, but by far and large, the most common would be the food addiction scale. Now, that assesses a range of different symptoms, up to 11 symptoms. It also then can classify the severity, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, depending on the number of symptoms that an individual may endorse. If we look at systematic reviews in this area, using that now food addiction scale, around 15 to 20% of the population endorse these addictive eating behaviours, and most often we would see it occurring in its severe form, meaning that individuals don't likely have 1 or 2 symptoms of food addiction, but more likely 6 or more symptoms for addictive eating behaviours. So these are things that we should be considering because that's quite a considerable number, and there is social acceptance around these terms. So increasingly so, I will be encouraging you to start conversation around these particular behaviours when it comes to an individual's weight status. So it's one thing for us to think about, well, the social narrative around consumers and their terminology and acceptance of these particular terms and how it influences perhaps someone's dietary intake. But now often like to offer a complementary view to see what the social narrative is around what their health professionals actually think. So this was a survey that our research group did with 175 different types of health professionals, 175 different people that come to the survey from a range of different backgrounds. So it could include dietitians, psychologists, healthcare providers, and it also included a small amount of the population being those in their final year of their health degree as an emerging health practitioner. So the mean age of this sample was 38 years. They were an international cohort, largely residing from Australia, but we did have some UK representation and also some from America. They worked in a variety of different settings, whether that be private practice or within a local hospital or clinical-based setting. Most often, they worked with clients or consumers in that adult age group ranging between 25 and 65 years, but we did have some practitioners working with younger adults or in that older adult over the age of 65 years. So 72% of these health practitioners have been actually asked for assistance or help or guidance around addictive eating. So there is a social narrative there and consumers and clients are asking for help for these particular behaviours. Many health professionals were interested in this term becoming a diagnostic term, but they also believe that food addiction was a stigmatising term. So I guess when we're talking about addictive eating, we could talk about emotional eating or stress-related eating, and some of the terminology that was preferred by some health practitioners included compulsive overeating, as you can see on the slide there, or other terms that was compulsive overeating or addictive eating behaviours. So perhaps maybe using client or consumer-based language, but bringing up this idea of the different behaviours and the why people eat in particular ways is increasingly important, not necessarily just focusing on the dietary intake. So I guess in this very short presentation, I'd be very happy to answer questions or have longer conversations about this, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about, well, how might management look a little bit different. So we might have someone who would like some assistance to improve their weight status, and so how could management look a little bit different than just focusing in on what food choices they could change or swap or those types of things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of our research studies that we have in Australia that's currently, it's just analysing all the data. This is the TRACE program, which stands for Targeted Research on Addictive and Compulsive Eating. Now, this is a body of work that initially started with just a small feasibility study to see if there was acceptance to recruit people into a study around addictive eating. focusing in on the why people eat in particular ways rather than a really strict dietary approach. That feasibility, we did a process evaluation, so we asked those participants what they liked, what they didn't like, in relation to the number of sessions, the length of the sessions, the content of the sessions, which allowed us to then refine that particular intervention. And then we took on a co-design approach to improve it further by co-designing with consumers who have a lived experience with addictive eating and increased weight status, as well as health professionals. But interestingly, when we think of this area of addictive emotional eating or why people eat in particular different ways, then we need to be thinking about all the different types of health professionals that may be having these conversations with individuals or where that conversation might arise. So when we co-designed this next iteration of the TRACE program, we talked to dietitians, we talked to psychologists, we talked to those in the mental health space with an addiction background, depression and anxiety, and we also talked to neuroscientists who could bring that more neurodevelopment, brain response research area and expertise and clinical expertise to help co-design this. So then the next iteration of that TRACE program was then run in a randomised control trial. This was run on telehealth to increase the accessibility of services for addictive like eating behaviours, and they had 5 telehealth sessions with a dietitian and a self-guided workbook, and they also had support through a research study specific website and some support through a closed Facebook group. And then this was then compared to our self-guided group, similar to, I guess, a cognitive behaviour therapy online version. And then we had a waitlist control, and we're currently writing those results up. But I thought I would share with you, in closing today's presentation, just around what an intervention could look like. So this was just 5 sessions, so by far and large, not a intensive intervention, but that was done deliberately so. So 5 sessions, and you can see too, looking at these content of these sessions, focusing in on personality, focusing in on food, and then coping mechanisms such as skills, but it really focuses in on why we eat. So we include things in there such as mood monitor checklists, so we can start to really characterise, where issues may exist for someone. So whether it's eating out of boredom or a particular time of day, or why we're eating in particular, and then relate back to the types of foods that are actually chosen, and perhaps where issues might lie, to I guess identify goals that would really focus in on those initial problem areas. It is a lifestyle multi-behaviour intervention, so it does focus in on food, but it also just discusses with the client things such as sleep, physical activity, as well as alcohol and caffeine intake on emotional health. So I guess we're in the last stage of just analysing that data, but it does look really promising in terms of changing people's lifestyles for the better by focusing on why we eat rather than the choices that we actually make in relation to particular foods. So I guess in closing in the presentation today, I'd really like us to think about the why people eat and focusing in, because there is really a social narrative around that. There's acceptance of that term around food addiction or emotional eating, and there's really acceptance and social narrative both in the consumers, but also health professionals. So I would encourage you to actively open the conversation with clients if you are working in that particular space. And I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you. And I'd just like to acknowledge that NHMRC from supporting my research fellowship, but also the amazing team in which I work that have contributed to this body of work on addictive like eating. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right, there we go. So I'd now like to welcome Dr. Laura McGowan, who's a psychologist and lecturer in nutrition and behaviour change at Queen's University Belfast. And Laura's going to be talking about the psychological implications of weight stigma for people living with obesity. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Jason, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Jordan and to Louisa for inviting me along to speak with you today. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm hoping in my 15 minutes left I can just share with you a little bit of the research on the island of Ireland, actually, so sort of bringing it back to this context where we find ourselves in today, around weight stigma, views by people living with obesity and beliefs about obesity that we've gleaned from some of our research. So by way of background then, in Ireland, in the south of Ireland where we find ourselves, and we see in the statistics that over 6 out of 10 adults are considered to have overweight or obesity, and around 23% of those adults are considered to be living with obesity. In Northern Ireland, so in the top half of this island, in the north where I come from, then we're at about 65% of the adult population living with overweight or obesity. So who are above what's considered a healthy BMI. And as a sidebar, we'll not go into the issues around BMI as a kind of defining factor, but nonetheless, those are the sort of statistics that we live with and that we hear about on a population level. But this presents us with some significant challenges around management of weight. So in Ireland, down here in the south, there's been some really great progress over the last number of years. And that really started with the development of this national clinical programme for obesity. So there is now a model of care, and that has now been fully resourced. And so there are some really good plans underway and care pathways in place and clinical guidelines around the sort of care and management of people who are living with obesity. But in Northern Ireland, we still follow this kind of tiered approach, if you like, this triangular pyramid, and much like the rest of the UK, where sort of the more specialist obesity services are at the top of that pyramid. And we actually don't have any NHS or health service funded bariatric service pathways for those living with obesity. And we also don't really have any dedicated specialist tier 3 services. So we rely on these kind of tier 2, if you like, these kind of lower level, will often get called lifestyle in inverted commas, or sort of commercial weight management provider services that people often have to pay for because they also aren't available via the NHS. But we do have an opportune moment because there is a new strategy under development for the kind of management and prevention of obesity in Northern Ireland. So, and I'm part of that group. So this is a kind of an opportune moment to think about it. But when we think about what does the research tell us about the experiences of those people who are living with overweight or obesity, or the beliefs that surround living with obesity here in the UK or on the island of Ireland, we know less, because a lot of that research actually has kind of grown from other countries like America, for example. So I'm going to present to you a couple of different studies that we've done that sort of try to shed a little bit of light on this in my brief slot. So the first of which was a project called the Public Acceptability of Policies to Address Obesity on the Island of Ireland. And this was a piece of work funded by Safe Food. It was conducted in collaboration with my colleague Miriam Heinen, who was then the PI who was based in UCD, University College Dublin here. And it was based on some previous work that had been done in 2014. They'd done a cross-sectional survey in the Republic of Ireland, looking at sort of different policies that people felt would be acceptable as ways and sort of measures to prevent largely obesity. But in 2020 then, when we sort of got funded for this project, we added a new section into this piece of research, which really focused on experiencing weight-based stigma, people's perceptions around living with obesity, and any experiences of kind of weight-based discrimination. And we did this through a number of different pieces of research, which I'll slightly glean over, but we had lots of involvement from both people with lived experience of obesity and also from kind of external stakeholders and experts in the development of 2 measures. So we had a questionnaire-based measure that went out to over 1,000 people across the island of Ireland, north and south. And then we also then explored some of the key findings from that survey in focus groups and with people afterwards to really try and get to the nitty-gritty of why people were answering questions in the way they were. So what we found was that 10% of our overall sample of those 1,049 adults said that they had experienced some form of weight-based discrimination. And what we found was that was across the whole weight spectrum, so that wasn't necessarily just those who were living with overweight or obesity, but actually that figure was significantly higher in those who had been living with a higher weight, and there was a kind of dose response with that. We also then looked at a few beliefs around obesity and perceptions of obesity. So what we found was that 82% of people thought that people living with obesity should have the same rights as others to treatment in the healthcare service. We found that 56% of people, more than half the sample, felt that people living with obesity were negatively portrayed in the media and in advertising and so on. Around 52, only around half the sample supported the use of images and people living with obesity purposefully in kind of advertising and so on and marketing materials. And quite alarmingly, a quarter of the sample said that they felt that people living with obesity could not be as good workers as people of a healthy weight, and there was no other information specified in that statement. So we then explored this a little bit more, as I say, in focus groups with people, and we heard people talk about really quite significantly about either their own personal experience of weight-based discrimination, which quite often was passed off as what we call here banter, which may not translate to universally, but it's that kind of jovial, a bit of a joke sort of kind of manner, which we know for people living with obesity is not funny. There was also slightly conflicting views around media and this kind of portrayal of people living with obesity in fashion and so on. And whilst in some respects people felt that was a good thing, that to have those sites available, there were often conflicting views around what they might have called kind of glamorizing the issue. But they did also talk about different ways that we needed to kind of think about to reduce weight-based stigma and discrimination. And this is just a quote, which I'll let you read, from one of our participants who said that he'd gone into a shop to buy a suit, a sort of normal high street retailer, and they essentially laughed at him and said to him, no, it's another store for you, which was known for being a sort of specific retailer for people with a higher body weight. So some of the key messages from that piece of research, I think, are that we found out that stigma was pervasive on the island of Ireland, based on body shape or size, but the public understanding of the issue was still slightly behind. It's nuanced, and people felt that they weren't clear about the impact of it on others. We know that the framing of obesity-related messages in health campaigns and the media can shape public opinion, so this is a really important issue. And so we felt that this showed us that there was a greater need for education alongside these wider sort of structural and changes that are needed in society. But we then also took, as part of one of my PhD students' research, we then took these findings to another group of adults with lived experience of obesity to try and discuss them in a bit more detail with them and make sense of them. And it was really interesting because talking to them about these survey results, they sort of still echoed these really strong words around feelings of personal responsibility for weight, even in their own experience. Saying things like, I know, but it's my fault, and talking about their weight status and without any reference to any other contributing factors except their own willpower, which really highlighted the high levels of self-stigma that's still going on. But they did also talk about how stigma and weight-based discrimination and experiencing stigma was so unique and individual. What one person might consider a stigmatizing experience or a discriminatory event may not be the same as another. And so there was this really highly nuanced view around it. So the second study I want to then briefly mention is one then where we sort of focused in then more on those who had experience specifically of living at a higher weight. So this was a study that we did exploring the kind of motivations and the experiences of adults who were living with obesity. And this was a cross-sectional survey that we conducted online in Northern Ireland. So we had just over 200 people in our sample. As you can see, there were some limitations with our sample, so we did have a predominantly female set of responses. We had relative spread across the age groups from 18 to 55 plus, and it was quite highly educated. So 2/3 of the adults reported a degree or higher from university. We did have really high white ethnicity, but believe it or not, that does somewhat reflect the population still of Northern Ireland. And all did have experience of living at a higher weight. 85% said they were currently living at a higher weight, and almost 50% said that they were living with obesity specifically. And what we found was that over 95% of them had tried to reduce their weight in the past, but over 75% of them had not sought any formal help to do so. And when we looked at that data in a slightly different way, we found that more than 9 out of 10 adults who would like to manage their weight have not sought help from weight management services. And that might also reflect the situation in Northern Ireland, where we do have really limited pathways for obesity care. But we then asked things about, if you were to access a weight management service, for example, what would your motivation be? And you can see a broad spread, and I apologise if these are a bit small, but I'll highlight the key things. So the top rated motivation was to improve health. To reduce weight was quite highly rated for these patients or these people living with obesity, but actually equally so were things like self-esteem, improving mood and body image, which I think really echoes some of the things that Ken and Susie have just talked about as well. And I think down at this end of the scale, it's important to note that having been advised to by a healthcare professional or having been advised to by friends or family were some of the least motivating factors. So again, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be having those conversations, but I think we need to think about how we frame them and how they're delivered. We also then asked them a little bit about their views about sort of weight management services, and these were more practical around the kind of model of delivery they would like. And the key thing that came through was they wanted this ongoing support that was flexible, either free or low cost, delivered by a combination of different professionals, and it could be online, face-to-face and so on. People didn't feel too strongly about that. They liked having a face-to-face component. They did also like the idea of shorter session lengths. But one of the key things I think that came out of this was when we then asked about what outcomes of a weight management service to improve health should be, what should they be based on? You can see here this key role for these psychologically based services and interventions. So the priority was given to improving quality of life, improving well-being and improving mood above anything else. Now you'll see here there was still a place for support for physical activity changes or changes with dietary behaviours and so on, but indeed these kind of psychological components were rated most highly. And again, when we took these findings and discussed them with our group of adults who had lived experience of obesity, they really echoed this idea of the need for continuous and flexible support in a weight management journey, kind of coming in and out as and when it's required, and highlighted this variety of motivations for people. They're not all the same, and even when we look at this data split into age categories, we can see some slightly different motivating factors between the age groups, but they all sort of supported the fact that peer support was key. So just then, as a final part to my talk, I wanted to mention then a role for some of the work that I've been involved in over the last number of years, and that's really around this idea of habit formation. So what are habits? So we all talk about habits in our kind of daily language, and we don't think of them necessarily in this theoretical sense, but essentially a habit or a habitual behaviour is something that we have formed because we've repeatedly enacted a behaviour over and over in response to the same cue or context until the point where our brain almost makes a little shortcut. It acquires something called automaticity. And the unique thing about those habits is that our brain makes those little shortcuts, and the idea is that it makes enacting those behaviours just that little bit easier because they're almost automatically cued, if you like, or the sequence of those behaviours are automatically cued when you encounter that cue or context over time. So the idea is, can we help to make people have healthy behaviours that are automatically cued, as well as thinking about the ones that we all have that are unhealthy, like maybe wanting something sweet every time we have a hot drink or those types of things. So some of this evidence really started to be gathered in the early 2011, 2013. Colleagues of mine in UCL had done a study with adults, and then I also replicated this with adults with young children. So this was in preschoolers actually, and it was about parental feeding habits. But we then took this same idea of not focusing on weight, but focusing on this creation of these healthy habitual behaviours in relation to dietary choices or dietary intake and physical activity. And then we did it in adults, and this was called the 10 top tips for a healthy weight. And this was tested in a randomised controlled trial. And then we also have done it most recently in the HIP study. So this is the Healthy Habits in Pregnancy and Beyond study. And this has been a study where we've really found there's nothing available to women who were entering pregnancy at a higher weight and to support them with their healthy behaviours. So what we did was we used really all of our resources to try and involve lived experience at the heart of the design and adaptation of this intervention. And really what that has shown so far are some really good feasibility and acceptability data. So people were saying, well, I think it should be offered to whoever should want to do it, for example, or it should be offered to everyone. I was happy in how it was phrased and so on. So we feel the PPIE had a really important role to play in this study. But I would just highlight with these two slightly longer quotes that there are also these connotations still of really negative words coming out from participants around weight and being shameful, for example, weight gain being shameful, or saying things like, okay, so my baby had a heartbeat, but I'm fat. Those were the words of participants. So I think there is still a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of how we then blend aspects into those interventions and to help improve those kind of psychological aspects for people. And just to kind of finally mention the DEN-HAB study, this is just another example of a study that we did in Queen's, where we've again used this habit formation model in patients who had had some form of tooth replacement to focus on creating these healthy eating behaviours, and again, no focus on weight. And this was rated as highly acceptable and to participants. And again, I think a big strength of that has come from our engagement with our Belong group. So this was our little patient and public involvement and engagement group who shaped that study as well. And then this work is now being published. So again, you can find some of that online if you're interested. So really, to summarise from these kind of brief research insights on the island of Ireland, I think that what we've seen is that stigma is still, weight-based stigma is still pervasive, but there is a limited understanding about what it is and the impact that it has. There's a clear and urgent need for our evidence-based services, particularly in Northern Ireland, to then encompass these kind of psychological support elements. And we do still need to think about how we support people in those kind of health behaviour changes, using these kind of theoretical frameworks, using behaviour change techniques, figuring out exactly what it is that's working for people and why. And that habits, using this kind of habit model has shown a bit of promise, where we've taken the focus off weight and focused on creating healthy habitual behaviours. But key to all of this is collaboration with people living with obesity, and that's key to our research in this area and in terms of our service design. So that's it. My contact details will be on the slides, and I look forward to seeing you all at the UK Congress on Obesity in September, which I'll be hosting at Queen's University, Belfast. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Laura. We are going to keep all questions to the end. That was a really insightful presentation. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Dasha Nichols, who's a clinical reader in child psychiatry at Imperial College London and a specialist advisor on obesity to NHS, on eating disorders to NHS England. And she's going to be talking about improving the medical narrative around the needs of children and young people living with obesity and emotional disordered eating. Dasha will be joining us via Zoom, and it is a slightly longer presentation, but she's going to give us some real insights from her clinical practice, which I think you'll find really insightful. Thank you. Here we go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dasha Nichols. I'm a child and adolescent eating disorder psychiatrist. I work primarily as an academic at the Imperial College London, as a clinician in central and north west London, and I'm also the National Specialist Advisor on eating disorders to NHS England. Much of my talk today will come from the perspective of what's happening in England, but I hope will have resonance for the rest of you from other parts of Europe. I am really sorry not to be able to be there in person, but I am coming over for Friday and Saturday, and we'll be speaking in the plenary session on Saturday morning if anybody wants to catch me in person to discuss any of what I'm planning to talk about today. But I'm delighted to be part of this symposium, bringing together two fields that I have been keen to encourage dialogue between for a long time. This is my first obesity conference, but I've been talking about the overlap between eating disorders and obesity for well over 5 years now, and I hope to bring it even more onto my agenda. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you can see my slides in full screen. So the title of my talk is Understanding the Needs of Children and Young People Living with Emotional and Disordered Eating and Obesity, Improving the Medical Narrative. and I will reflect at the end on what's meant by the last part of that statement. I'm going to start by defining the terms. What do we mean by disordered eating behaviour, and how does it differ from eating disorders? Why is there a need for conversation between the eating disorders field and the obesity field? Why is collaboration necessary? What are the challenges to collaboration? What are the points of connection? What might collaboration look like? And how can we improve that medical narrative? Now, apologies for those to whom this is familiar territory, but I think it's just helpful to ensure that we're on the same page about language. So what are eating disorders? This is just one definition, but it's a useful one, I find, in terms of breaking it down into thoughts, feelings and behaviours, which is how mental disorders are defined. Then eating disorders are habitual appearance. The definition of eating disorders is persistent, that's a key word, disturbance of eating behaviour or behaviour intended to control weight, which significantly impairs physical health or psychosocial functioning. And those last parts of the sentence are key because impairment and distress are the definition of when something moves from being healthy into being pathological from a disorder, mental disorder perspective. Because much of mental disorder boundaries very closely onto normal behaviour and normal thoughts and feelings. And in the context of eating disorders, the thoughts and feelings tend to be driven by a fear of fatness, a fear of obesity, if you like, or extreme distress about eating behaviour. So just going back to that definition, what's meant by persistent disturbance of eating behaviour? Well, there are really only two eating behaviours that we're concerned about. Binge eating behaviour, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That's defined by eating a large amount of food, whether it's subjective or objective, within a short space of time with the perception of being unable to stop. Or a loss, in other words, a loss of control over eating behaviour. And for those of you who've met people who binge eat, you'll know that it's not just eating until you're full. It's truly almost a dissociative experience where you really experience it as unstoppable, almost as if you've been kind of cut off from the ability to control your own behaviour. The second is restricted eating, and in this context, intended to control weight, as opposed to restricted eating, for example, on the basis of sensory features of food, like you might find in an avoidant restricted food intake behaviour. And I'm not including those kinds of presentations in my in this definition of eating disorders. What do we mean by behaviour intended to control weight? Well, there again, restricted eating when it has the purpose of controlling weight, and sometimes that can look like fasting for long periods of time. Self-induced vomiting, well, that's an easy one because that's always pathological. Excessive exercise, again, long debates about when do you know something is excessive. An example I sometimes give is I had a patient who was still jogging around school with a broken leg. Exercising in the face of injury is one way of knowing that exercise is excessive. And then other behaviours might look like the misuse of medications such as laxatives, diuretics, and other energy burning or appetite suppressing and anti-obesity medications of various kinds. And then there are also more subclinical ones, people who choose to drink 8 cans of Diet Coke a day for the caffeine and the lack of calories rather than taking in adequate nutrition. And then in terms of how do we, when is something disordered eating behaviour rather than eating disorder? Well, an eating disorder has to reach a threshold in terms of persistence, how long it's been going on for, in terms of frequency, in terms of whether it's sufficiently characteristic for it to be a primary presenting problem. And when we see these behaviours, but in the absence of those characteristics that characteristics that render it fully diagnostic, that's when we would tend to call it disordered eating behaviour. So when these behaviours are intermittent, for example, or when they're seen in the context of other primary disorders. So disordered eating behaviour has an indication either of lack of persistence or a lack of primacy in terms of its being the problem behaviour. And then I touched on the area of impairment, but in eating disorders that can be a physical impairment or psychosocial impairment. Physical impairment, there's some examples here in terms of impacts on growth and development, menses, brain function, osteoporosis and high mortality, which in the eating disorders field is not simply associated with low weight. Purging disorder, for example, has an extremely high mortality, standardized mortality ratio. And then in terms of psychosocial functioning, this is where some of those behaviours are often, sometimes people with eating disorders are able to function relatively well in some domains, particularly academically, for example, or in work contexts. And where they show impairment is in their forming of relationships, particularly intimate relationships. Because if you are, if you don't like your body and you're unable to eat in the context of other people, and your eating behaviour is significantly disturbed, that really can interfere with intimate and family relationships, as I'm sure you can imagine. And then the other level of impairment is distress, and that's a characteristic of binge eating disorder. Is one of the criteria for binge eating disorder is that the binge eating behaviour is causing significant distress or impairment. So I'm going to give a couple of clinical examples from my practice, which illustrate some of the issues in children and young people with disordered eating behaviour at higher weight. So the first is Jo. She's 13. She presented with low mood and binge eating behaviour. She's trying to focus on schoolwork, but finds it increasingly difficult because she feels sad most of the time and is unable to get out of bed for days at a time, and is eating in secret despite feeling full. She's had a difficult relationship with body image, food and eating since her early years. She recalls being humiliated in primary school by hurtful comments from her peers, and she also remembers her mother making hurtful comments about her size, which added to her low self-esteem and poor body image. Jo started restricting and purging during the first national lockdown when she felt isolated from her friends. She began eating to excess at night despite feeling full. She skips lunches on school days and buys sweets on her way home from school. She eats dinner and then orders snacks such as chicken nuggets or hamburgers to follow on, despite feeling full. She uses her debit card to do this secretly. Jo's father collapsed in front of her when she was 10 and is now physically disabled, unable to work and depressed. He lost his business, their home, and his marriage broke up. He lives with extreme pain and some days cannot function. Jo feels he has no one else than her. Her mother lives on the other side of town and struggles to make ends meet, working long hours for little pay. Jo is a strong and determined young person who's trying to make her best of a very difficult situation. She'd like to find more healthy ways to cope and is motivated to make changes. Diagnostically, she would meet criteria for binge eating disorder. I didn't talk about the frequency of her binges, but they were probably daily. And I didn't give her weight and height, but she would have been classified as having class 2 obesity. The second case is Anna. Anna is 15 and she's in year 10. In England, that's around age 14, 15. Her eating problems started in year 9, so a year earlier, prior to the onset of the pandemic. She was finding it difficult to settle in socially at school, and having joined only the previous year. Most people in the UK join secondary school in year 7, so she was a year late joining her peer group and found it difficult to integrate herself into the social circles that had developed already. A friend of hers started losing weight and she decided to join her because she knew she was overweight. Lockdown started and the whole family decided to start eating healthily. And initially everybody praised Anna for her weight loss. By the time she reached the eating disorder service, the rest of the family had stopped losing weight, but Anna's intake had continued to decline, and she had been having 90 calories a day for around 4 weeks. Her total weight loss had been over 20 kilograms. She was still classified technically as overweight. She was 114% median BMI for age. Her pulse and her blood pressure were okay, but she was shut down peripherally. I was unable to get blood from her, for example. Initially, when she presented, she was determined to keep losing weight. She had a very black and white thinking style, meaning she would say things like, well, I'm never going to eat X or I'm never going to do Y. And her interpersonal function was unusual. She was very selective about who she thought was interesting and who she wanted to socialise with. She responded very well initially to a family-based treatment approach, but as she started to eat again, she began to binge and struggled to control her weight. Diagnostically, she would have atypical anorexia nervosa in DSM-5. That's all the features of anorexia nervosa, but she hasn't reached a very pathologically low weight. In ICD-11, which, as we know, is on stream now in most of the rest of the world, she would meet criteria for anorexia nervosa because atypical anorexia nervosa is not pulled out as a separate diagnosis, and anorexia nervosa includes people who behave in all the ways of the characteristic of anorexia nervosa, regardless of whether they've reached a significantly low weight or not. Common themes in these clinical cases are disordered eating behaviour in the context of higher weight, long-standing struggles with weight control, clear psychological and social factors triggering and maintaining the problem. So taking a step back, why is collaboration between the obesity and eating disorders fields needed in cases such as Joe and Anna? Well, I would suggest to collaborate around prevention and around treatment. And prevention has a number of different aspects to it. Firstly, there are shared risk factors for the development of obesity and eating disorders. Secondly, there's a need to address the reciprocal relationship between obesity and eating disorders. Obesity is a risk factor for eating disorders in that people at higher weight are more likely to have negative body image and to engage in dieting behaviours, which are the two best established risk factors, particularly in females. And people with eating disorders are at risk of obesity if that eating disorder involves binge eating behaviour. And then the other reason we need to collaborate around prevention is the potential harms of opposing messaging, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And then around treatment, I'm going to pose the question really about whether our services are fit for purpose, whether they're equipped to provide the care that Joe and Anna need. And for various reasons would suggest that they're not as well equipped as perhaps they might be. So what are some of the challenges around collaboration between the obesity and eating disorders fields? Well, I've divided this broadly into three areas. The first is what I'm characterising as public health versus clinical approaches. The second is focus and perspectives on weight and BMI. And the other side of that coin, assumptions about thoughts and feelings in young people at higher weight. So the first topic was around public health versus clinical approaches. For obvious reasons in terms of the prevalence of obesity, there has been a focus on public health approaches to obesity. But public health approaches inevitably and by definition reach the whole of the public rather than just those that they're targeted to. And therein lies the problem that some public health approaches to obesity have potential to be harmful to people with eating disorders. And here are a couple of examples from the UK of what I would call fairly standard public health infographics around the harms of obesity. But I hope you would agree that the kind of message here really is that is to cause anxiety, is to cause concern about obesity. And in those who are prone to anxiety and anxiety about weight, it's likely to be exacerbated by messages like these. Anxiety about weight being the core pathology of eating disorders. Now, these are relatively mild and tempered versions. There are, of course, much more in-your-face versions of anxiety, deliberately anxiety-provoking public health messaging around obesity, where there was a deliberate attempt to cause anxiety, create shame and stigma, and potentially encourage behaviours that would be considered pathological from an eating disorders perspective. By contrast, when I googled in preparation for this talk, similar images around eating disorders prevention, I came up with almost nothing. This page is intentionally left blank, representing the absence of public health approaches to eating disorders, at least in my country. I know there are some exceptions to that, but I would think that they are the exception rather than the rule. Eating disorder services have lived almost entirely in the clinical domain. And one of the things I'm really pleased about is that that narrative is shifting, that there is now more emphasis on eating disorders prevention. But I would suggest that it's still not joined up with obesity prevention thinking. With eating disorders services, and when we try to have those conversations around prevention bring eating disorders concerns to the obesity agenda, and those concerns have been listened to, the argument is often that eating disorders are less prominent, that they're rare. And I think increasingly the evidence says that that's not true. Eating disorders are affecting a really significant proportion of the population and really have become a public health problem in their own right. And I hope that that means that there will soon be much more concerted effort to improve public health approaches to eating disorders. The second area of contention, I think, is around the narratives around BMI. And I'm using this as an illustration. This is not my J-shaped curve around the relationship between mortality and BMI, but it illustrates a point, which is that the pathologization of weight at the higher weight end of the weight spectrum happens a lot earlier and a lot further into the normative curve than it does at the lower weight end of the spectrum. So I've reviewed a number of papers where the definition of underweight is defined as below the second percentile, but the definition of overweight is the line is drawn in a very different place. And the blue straight lines that you can see on this graph are my additions, showing that if you were to take the equivalent mortality at the lower end of the so-called normal weight spectrum, it is comparable to a BMI of nearly 35 at the higher weight end of the spectrum. Whilst I'm fully understandable of the arguments, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that there aren't risks associated with being at higher weight, there isn't a comparable level of concern at the lower weight end of the spectrum, where those of us who work in the eating disorders field could produce just as much evidence about the harms of being underweight. And what this leads to is a bias in emphasis, because the proportion of people, obviously, who fall into those pathological categories, if you draw the line in a different place, to start to encroach on a really significant proportion of the population. Whereas, and that has implications for the definition of health. So some of you may be familiar with this controversial study that was undertaken in Sydney of intermittent fasting for adolescent obesity. And you'll notice the title says Fast Track to Health. Now there's an intrinsic contradiction there from an eating disorders perspective, which is that in order to achieve health from a BMI perspective, there's the iatrogenic prescribing of a pathological disordered eating behaviour, which is fasting in adolescents. So health is very much in the eye of the beholder. This would be considered poor mental health in the interests of good physical health. I am pleased, however, that the controversy about that study did exist, because what it did was stimulate some conversation between the two fields, and including particularly Hiba Jabali, who you can see as the second author there, and who's here at this conference, has been really at the forefront of looking at and driving the interests in this area around where the boundary is between healthy weight management and weight management strategies that result in disordered eating behaviour. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as a point of connection between the two fields in a moment. The other part of the BMI story is that there's a relative neglect in the literature about underweight, thinness, which is the opposite of obesity. Eating disorders are not the opposite of obesity. Eating disorders are defined by thoughts and feelings. Thinness is defined by BMI at the opposite end of the spectrum. And you may be interested in this study, which is just going to press, which showed that the prevalence of thinness amongst 14-year-olds was comparable to the prevalence of obesity using international task force cut-offs, and that some of the factors that contributed to persistent thinness as opposed to persistent obesity were very similar to the sort that you might expect to see in persistent obesity. In other words, mental health factors, attachment factors, birth weight, sex, ethnicity, maternal BMI, activity levels, and so on. And so when people are talking about healthy weights, I always challenge and say, we're talking about healthy weight at both ends of the spectrums, because there has been a relative neglect of thinness in the interests of discussion about the obesity crisis. The other important thing is that from a eating disorders clinician and researcher perspective, obesity is simply defined by a number on a cross-sectional basis, and that tells you very little about the thoughts and feelings, but it also tells you very little about the developmental trajectory of the weight. And there's a couple of papers that I think are really key here from a child and adolescent perspective. The first is from the Rocky Mountains study, Mustillo et al., which showed 4 main trajectories of BMI through adolescence. The first, which is the commonest, was about 73%, stayed roughly on their centile for BMI. The second group gained weight quite significantly during adolescence. The third group lost weight considerably during adolescence, and the fourth group were, sorry, I've given the numbers the wrong way around. The third group were the ones that had persistent high weight since childhood, and the fourth group were the group that lost weight during adolescence. And I think that's really interesting, because I would suggest that those 4 groups really do look quite different in terms of the sorts of factors that contribute to those trajectories. Relatively recently, there's been an attempt to replicate that study looking at obesity trajectories. This study didn't find the weight loss group. They didn't identify a group that lost weight during adolescence. I don't know whether that was healthy weight loss or whether it was people developing eating disorders. But obviously that's a question that we would like to be able to answer. But what they did do was replicate the 2 groups of effectively normative BMI gain through development, so that in other words, reaching overweight status by midlife. And that was the majority of the population. And then there was a group who gained weight during adolescence, and you can see that they are the group that had the worst outcomes in terms of BMI. And then the other group was those who had persistent onset since early childhood. And again, I would suggest that there's likely to be quite significant differences between who was in each of these groups in terms of the psychosocial risk factors. Which leads us really to think, what might a psychologically attuned approach to obesity start to look like? Because research would suggest that, well, that some people with obesity do show high levels of dietary restraint and therefore at risk of eating disorders, and others don't. Some people with obesity are prone to emotion-driven eating, binge eating, loss of control eating, addictive eating behaviours, and others are not. Some people with obesity have negative body image, others really don't. Some people with obesity display specific temperamental traits, others don't. And some people with obesity, and I think most of the data at a population level, not at a clinical level, this is the majority, show no specific psychological and behavioural problems, but their weight and eating patterns may be impacted by factors in their immediate family or peer environment that are amenable to intervention, and suggesting that these groups might need quite different approaches depending on what's going on. There's a need to also think about language between the 2 fields. When I was president of the Academy for Eating Disorders a long time ago now, it feels like 13 years ago, there had been a minister in the UK who was very intent on obesity, just call them plain fat, shaming, naming and shaming, and hopefully we have moved on from this point, but sadly I think in some spheres this really hasn't shifted as much as we would have liked. The Academy for Eating Disorders made a statement at that time, which I think still stands today, that there's strong evidence that shaming has been effective and damaging, that negative body image worsens lifestyles, that non-judgmental language is necessary, and so on. In other words, there are many points of contact, many points of connection. We have a shared agenda. This is one of a few studies that has looked at the way that obesity rates over time are mirrored by disordered eating rates. This is South Australia, this is data in adults, but you can see it almost a parallel line. Weight stigma is clearly an area of consensus between the two, although this statement, there was an opportunity, I think, for this to come out of the joint statement between the two fields, which and perhaps a second iteration might be. There are a number of important papers that I think it's important that we are all on the same page about knowing what the data is telling us here. One that I cite quite often is that in adolescent girls being labelled as too fat predicts unhealthy weight control behaviours and disordered eating cognitions over the next 5 years, independent of BMI and other socioeconomic factors. And then a key paper, a seminal paper from Kathy Loff and Diane Newmark-Steiner from Project EAT, following girls for 10 years who are overweight, and found that overweight girls with the lowest body satisfaction at BMI had nearly 3 BMI points higher, were nearly 3 BMI points higher at 10-year follow-up compared to overweight girls with higher body satisfaction. In other words, high body satisfaction was protective from both a mental health and from a physical health perspective in the long term. So a few years ago, Professor Philippa Deirdricks and I were asked by the Academy for Eating Disorders to try and put down in words some of the areas that we thought were common between our two fields. And this is embodied in a document called 9 Truths About Weight and Eating Disorders. And I'm not going to read them out now, but please do go and have a look at them, because I'd be really interested to know whether they resonate from the obesity world perspective as they do from the eating disorders world. But we hope that these areas of commonality would be a starting point for some increased dialogue between the fields. The other area that I mentioned briefly is the EDIT collaboration, and if you're interested in finding out more, the website's editcollaboration.com. And this is a collaboration between the obesity and eating disorders fields to identify the characteristics of people with obesity that are likely to influence eating disorder risk during weight management interventions, and to try and understand the individual characteristics that might put somebody at higher risk in that context. So what might collaboration between the fields look like? Well, there are opportunities, I think, to identify and treat binge eating and loss of control and arguably ADHD, but that's not the agenda today, in children and young people as mental health problems that drive continued weight gain and may account for some of those cases that in that rapid weight loss during weight gain during adolescence group. There's an opportunity to identify parents with untreated eating disorders, to ensure that obesity services are eating disorder sensitive and identify vulnerable people, children and young people, and that similarly that children and young people's eating disorder services identify people who might benefit from support with from weight management services, provided of course that they're going to be eating disorder sensitive and not re-trigger eating disorder behaviours. And then I put it in research, but also in bold, put it in capitals, but also in bold. There is definitely a need for more research in this area. So I'm delighted to have been part of a strategic oversight group looking at children and young people's weight management services across the UK, to try and introduce some of this thinking into the way that the Q clinics, as they're known, are going to be looking holistically at children and young people presenting at higher weight and think about holistic care plans. And equally in my role at NHS England, across the eating disorders pathway, where we'll be looking at prevention, there is an opportunity to think about the interaction between eating disorder services and weight management services. Because at the moment they operate in quite distinct domains, but here I emphasise the areas where there are potential overlap. And although I'm not suggesting that obesity should be classified as an eating disorder, because BMI alone doesn't tell us enough about cognitions and behaviours in any individual, nor am I suggesting eating disorders are reframed as weight disorders, because that would be overly focused on BMI, which we know is actively unhelpful in patients and something we've been criticised for as a profession. But I am suggesting that difficulties in weight control is core to what both sets of services are trying to manage, albeit coming from different perspectives and with different priorities, and that by failing to collaborate, we may be inadvertently perpetuating mind-body splits whilst thinking we're embodying their integration. So one of my mantras is to make sure that when anybody talks about weight management provision, as happens relatively frequently, I do ask whether they mean across the weight spectrum and whether they mean across obesity and eating disorders. So I suggest, in summing up, that children and young people's eating disorders have a bias towards delivering care for restrictive eating presentations, and I've confirmed that unfortunately recently delivering care to children and young people, delivering training, sorry, to eating disorder services. They confirmed that very few are set up to provide care for people with binge eating presentations. Equally, I suggest that obesity services under-recognise and under-refer children and young people with disordered eating behaviour, that we have an imperative to work together, and that there are a lot of good ideas out there already, but more research and good practice examples are needed. And I'm going to finish there, and thank you. Please do ask any questions.
Now move on to our final presentation, and I'm delighted to welcome Emma Murphy, who's going to talk to us. Emma is a psychotherapist specialising in disordered eating, and is also the founder and the clinical director of Eating Freely. Emma.
My friend Leanne is a yo-yo dieter. And for years I watched her battle with her weight, and I never knew what her underlying issue was, until one night she told me that when she was 4 years old, her baby sister died. Her mum, dad, and grandparents were all understandably devastated. But whenever Leanne got upset and tried to get somebody's attention, she was given sweets or a slice of cake or a fizzy drink as a treat to distract her from her feelings. And this is when Leanne, aged 4, learned how to self-soothe with food. And this is how binge eating disorder begins. So what is binge eating disorder? Well, it's regular episodes of binge eating, and it is the feeling of being out of control during the sessions. Many clients report an out-of-body experience. Binge eating itself is eating more quickly than normal, eating until you're uncomfortably full, eating large amounts of food when not actually hungry for food, eating alone or secret eating, including night eating, and experiencing significant feelings of shame, disgust, guilt, frustration, and anger or hatred of self. Now, of all the criteria listed here, the most important one is actually the last one, the feelings. Well, why do I say that? Well, we all eat for emotional reasons. We eat when we're happy, sad, commiserating, or celebrating. Emotional eating is a normal behaviour, but it's on the spectrum. So I might sit down in front of Netflix tonight after the stressful presentation of today and have a glass of wine and a family-sized bag of biscuits. So that's emotional eating, and I know that I'm doing it. But the difference is that I won't feel shame, disgust, remorse, or anger or hatred of myself afterwards. I go to bed, wake up tomorrow and get on with my day. Binge eating disorder is very different. Clients are often triggered by shame, and these feelings of shame and other strong emotions like anger and hatred of self have deep roots, usually going back to some kind of trauma or difficult adverse experience in the past. And that's why it's really important to be able to work through a trauma-informed lens with clients and patients. If you are working with clients with no understanding of trauma and its impact, you're likely to see a relatively high percentage of client dropout, or you will think the clients are non-compliant, or because they don't follow through on anything discussed or covered in sessions. We'll see a quick burst of action followed by stagnation and stuckness, and again, clients are likely to drop out. It's helpful to ask the right questions at the outset and give patients the opportunity to disclose emotional binge eating safely and in confidence, so that the correct multidisciplinary support can be put in place for them from the start. Currently, in many bariatric services, the disclosure of any form of disordered eating is grounds for disqualification from surgery. So what happens is one of two things. Either the patient does not disclose the true nature of their relationship with food because they know about this criteria, or they simply travel to another jurisdiction where no questions are asked. In Ireland and the UK, Turkey is a popular destination, and in the USA, it's Mexico. I needn't tell anybody here what the health risks are of someone going abroad for surgery, having one night recovery and travelling on 2 or 3 flights back home with no follow-up support. However, if our services were routinely providing specialist support to patients who resolve disordered eating prior to surgery, we could cut down on the number of medical tourists putting themselves at risk, and our services would see better outcomes for both the patient and the service provider. The link between obesity and trauma is not news. As far back as 1985, Dr. Vincent Felici began to highlight the connection between trauma and obesity in patients at his weight loss clinic. But at the time, nobody wanted to hear what Dr. Felici had to say. His patients were accused of lying and of social aggrandizement. And he was told to stop asking patients about trauma, and he sought funding for a large-scale study to investigate further. Eventually, 10 years after he first highlighted the connection between trauma and obesity, Felici, in collaboration with the CDC, conducted a study of over 17,000 patients of the Kaiser Permanente group. And in 1998, he published an article in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, which remains the most cited article of that journal history to this day. In 2016, a systematic review of over 70 studies combining a combined number of over 300,000 participants was published in the Journal of Behavioural Addictions by Tom Sano and colleagues out of Italy. And they looked at the relation between adverse events and obesity, PTSD and obesity, and adverse experience and binge eating disorder. Findings could not be more conclusive. The connection between trauma, disordered eating, and obesity are overwhelmingly clear. A significant percentage of patients with obesity-related health conditions have experienced trauma or adverse childhood experience and struggle with binge eating disorder as a result, like my friend Jan. When obesity is positioned as a disease requiring medication and/or surgery, and psychological support is not offered, it's like putting the temporary wheel on your car. It's a stopgap solution. It's only temporary, but the real work still has to be done. And the same goes for obesity-related health. Weight loss medication is a temporary fix, but what will the client do when they stop taking the medication? Bariatric surgery is also not the answer. There are too many patients who have adverse side effects or who experience weight regain within a couple of years. Disordered eating is the confounding factor. So why are the medical profession so adverse to integrating psychological support into the treatment pathway? When specialist support for binge eating disorder is in place, trauma is resolved, and clients no longer eat to self-soothe. They choose to nourish instead of punish themselves with food. Timing and coordination of the use of medication and/or surgery alongside psychological support ensures far better outcomes. Now, in our service, ahead of any initial consultation, we send out a form, and the first 2 questions are: what age are you? And how long have you been struggling with food, weight, and/or your body image? And this is just a tiny sample of responses we've received over the years, and it's absolutely representative of all the responses that we receive. You can see on the slide that the range of ages goes from 34 to 58. And I can tell you that a lot of clients only come forward for help between their 40s and their 60s. Our average client is between 35 and 55 years of age. So what does this tell you? It tells you that the problem didn't start today or yesterday. It started in childhood, and the client has struggled for decades. And in the next section of the form, where we ask, have you sought help with this before? We get a laundry list of services, including but not limited to Weight Watchers, Slim World, Unislim, liposuction, meals delivered to the door, personal trainers, gyms, you name it, they've done it. And none of it has helped, because focusing on weight loss does not work for these clients. The problem has to be something else. Looking to the research again, let's be clear on how big an issue disordered eating is in clients with obesity-related health issues. At least 30% of the many millions of adults worldwide seeking weight loss meet the criteria of binge eating disorder. In type 2 diabetes patients, it's almost 40%. And in bariatric surgery patients, it's almost 60%. And yet across the multi-billion-dollar weight loss, diabetes and obesity-related industries, there is practically no specialist support being offered to these clients or patients. What we see instead is regular high numbers of returning customers. And let's be honest, many weight loss providers rely on a revolving door revenue model as clients return again and again, often over decades. Weight loss is one of the very few services that has managed to absolve itself from failure. When it doesn't work, client blames themselves. That is impressive marketing. We also see a consistent percentage of clients or patients who are non-compliant. Why don't they just stick to the plan, take the medication, follow the diet? Again, it's put down to the patient being lazy or having no willpower or being resistant. And then we see dropout, people just did absence. So let's look at just some of the psychological factors underpinning these phenomena. Trauma, neglect, gastrointestinal issues. So we are beginning to understand a lot more about the importance of the gut-brain connection and the role of the gut microbiome. PTSD. And then there's diagnosed or undiagnosed neurodivergence from ADHD or autism to high impulsivity or high rigidity and the need for control, or as Susie referenced earlier, sensory processing issues. And finally, high anxiety and low mood. All of which feed into a client's motivation and ability to either stick to the protocol or not. Back to the research again. Neurodivergence has a genetic component, but it also has roots in trauma for some. Put simply, severe trauma impacts brain development. We've already seen the clear connection between trauma and disordered eating, and we know that there's a connection between trauma and neurodivergence. But then we can have a perfect trifecta of a client who has experienced trauma, is neurodivergent, and struggles with disordered eating, and that's not unusual. So what pill or surgery could possibly deliver anything like the level of support that client needs? I ran a masterclass for practitioners in April, and this is a question asked in the chat by a health coach from the USA. And the answer to this question is binge eaters never don't care about their weight and just carry on eating until they're obese, at which point they think, oh, I think I'll go to a health coach and get weight sorted out. Binge eating is a safety mechanism. It's serving a very important psychological purpose. It's not that the client doesn't care. This is an example of a client consciously or unconsciously neglecting themselves and their health, and self-neglect and a lack of self-care is often rooted in trauma. One of the first questions we ask clients to ask themselves is, will this decision I'm making right now to either eat or not eat nourish me or punish me? And that's as much from an emotional perspective as it is from a nutritional perspective. Are they punishing themselves with food when they are binge eating? Absolutely. But their psychological need for safety far outweighs any long-term risk to their health in the moment. We work with clients to first separate their food from their feelings and then their past from their present, which combined results in them letting go of what no longer works for them or serves them, which is the binge eating. On a very basic level, this client group experienced some kind of trauma or adverse childhood event, like my friend Leanne. And given that the problem almost always involved one or both parents, it was hard for that child to get the support they needed to make sense of what was going on. The almost universal personality type we see in clients of being perfectionistic with a high need for control and a deep fear of being seen as needy or weak leads to this child to try and self-regulate. They turn to food to cope. Food becomes their friend, their comfort blanket. And it's also critical to consider the type of trauma or adverse experience our clients have lived through. It's often sustained exposure to violence, diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness, alcoholism, physical, emotional, mental or sexual abuse, neglect, poverty, food scarcity, complicated grief, bereavement and loss, or drug addiction. These situations and others results in our clients' brains becoming wired for hypervigilance, and often they are on the PTSD spectrum. So it therefore takes very little for them to be triggered into their safety-seeking behaviours, binge eating. The deeper impact of trauma is the effect it has on the child's self-concept. Their interpretation of why dad is always angry, or why mum is never available for them, or why they get beaten, or why they don't get fed, is, well, it must be my fault. I must have done something wrong. Or if my own mum and dad don't love me, I must be unlovable. These thoughts, internalised as absolute truths over time, result in a lack of self-care and often unconscious self-neglect. So if we are to correctly and appropriately support clients in larger bodies who are experiencing health issues, the model of intervention must include screening to identify neurodivergence and/or disordered eating sooner rather than later. Where appropriate, medication to support the client has been brought to a psychological place where they can actually engage in the deeper work. And by that I mean when the client is full of cortisol and therefore highly anxious or severely depressed, they can't engage in the work that needs to be done. So certain medications do have to be in place for sure. Those who meet the criteria for disordered eating need to be given specialist support, nutritional, psychological and emotional. And this is what we do in Eating Freely. It works, and it works in a relatively short period of time. And finally, the client is supported in making the long-lasting lifestyle changes that will keep them in maintenance and minimise the risk of relapse. But these changes will only stick after the client has done the psychological work. If they haven't resolved their past, permanently reduced or removed their need for hypervigilance, and been able to then let go of their default coping strategy of binge eating, if they've not learned the ABC of assertiveness, boundaries and communication, then no lifestyle changes will stick. The correct support in the correct order, delivered in a way that keeps the client comfortable while moving them slowly and incrementally out of their comfort zone is key. And in my opinion, any service provider in obesity-related healthcare who's not incorporating psychological support for the 30 to 60% of their client population who are experiencing disordered eating is actually unethical. I will conclude with just 3 of the many testimonials we've received from clients over the years. And as you can see from these clients, the result of specialist support resolving binge eating goes way beyond weight loss. In fact, not one of the clients mentions, like very rarely our clients mention weight loss as any outcome of the treatment that we provide. What they do mention is their new language, a new way to talk with, to and for myself, empowerment, open doors, saying no, I treat myself so much better. I put myself first more, and I try to do what's good for me now. Prioritising self-care, moving on from the eating disorder. This is true permanent change. When the work has been done, clients choose to nourish instead of punish themselves with food, and the weight resolves itself.
Okay, so I think we are going to try and take a couple of questions. I realise that we're short of time and that some people will need to move on. We did start slightly later as well. Are Dasha and Tracy joining us live? Sure.
There is.
Question. Anybody? Yeah, if you want to come forward and ask.
Say who you are, where you from.
Hi, Katrina Costa. I'm from Exeter. I work in a bariatric service, and I would like to ask the last speaker, actually, you speak about, you talk about binge eating and the development in bariatric services and the need of psychological support, which we have. Our challenge is how to engage our patients in psychological support, as obviously, as you rightly kind of concluded, many people want surgery very quickly. So the challenge is how to engage people, and I don't know about your opinion as to how effective engagement of the people who've been treating all the psychological services. There may be a rate. How many sessions do you think are sufficient? And what's your opinion on the cycle of it over-restricting food with binge eating disorder, which you very often see as with people moving from overeating to really suddenly losing very huge amounts of weight, which are, but again, squeezing our flats.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So first of all, I think a lot of bariatric services, certainly here in Ireland, the bariatric services would have long waiting lists. At one point, I think in Common Kenn's Hospital, the waiting list is 3 years. That's through the public health service, and certainly one of our private hospitals, the waiting list is currently about 6 months. And I certainly don't see why patients couldn't be going through a psychological program while they're on the waiting list and giving them something to do, you know, and engaging them and working, putting the stepping stones in place for them so that when they have their surgery, there's a far higher likelihood of better outcome. The Eating Freely program, the program we deliver, is a very structured 3 to 6 month program. It's very easy for clients to follow, and it really does speak to a lot of the behaviours that they will need to adopt in order to have successful outcome from bariatric surgery. And I have a lot of, you know, issues around bariatric surgery and what is expected of the client afterwards, the patient afterwards, in terms of restricting. And a lot of patients do develop disordered eating after surgery, so they do tend to go into, a lot of clients can develop anorexia after surgery. So that's something to be aware of as well. I can't really speak to that today, but certainly I don't think there's any reason why clients couldn't be doing the program while they're waiting for surgery, if that's the situation that you have. And I also do feel that there is more of a desire in patients to get the help that they need. It's not just about the weight loss. They know it's about more than weight loss. And yes, they do want to lose weight. Yes, they want the surgery, but you know, the weight didn't come on overnight, and it's not going to go off overnight. You know, and deep down, I think a lot of clients know that. So I think if there was support available, they would be made for it. That answer the question.
Okay, do we have another question here? Microphone.
Hi, I'm Eugenia Mann from King's College London. I love all the intervention, especially because I want to underline this is the Mental Health Awareness Week. So very fitting session overall. I wanted to ask all the speakers, you know, like obesity often, like it's a matter of health, and health is a human right, but because there's this strong association and prejudice about obesity having something to do with personal responsibility, I wanted to ask, according to your experiences as patient representatives, researchers, and clinicians, have you ever had the feeling that this concept that health is a right that cannot be discussed is often overlooked in practice, and suddenly maybe even by the patients themselves because of internalized prejudice they might have about obesity? Thank you.
Was that to someone specific or just a general? Would anybody like to put themselves forward to answer that one?
I just think when we speak about health, we need to include mental health in there as standards. So when we say health, I think people think about physical health. And I don't think enough emphasis is put on mental health as being part of that right. So I certainly think that's a nice starting point.
Okay. Oh, Dasha.
I give a quick answer.
Yeah, Ken, no, you go first.
Oh, I think Dasha's
That
fine.
is the-
Oh, yeah.
We can't hear Dasha, whoever's in the booth. Somebody's trying to do something. Do you want to give an answer quickly, Ken, while we're waiting for Dasha to be heard?
So I think that patients in the UK, weight is the big issue in the early days post-operatively. And when the weight stops rapidly declining, then we're now trying to move people towards a more health-based focus and stop thinking about what's better just in terms of numbers. So more, and the current patient outcome measures aren't that good.
Nearly to the mental health arena where stigma was very, very strong for many years, and people are now claiming their right to care. I hope it won't be long before that's reflected in this field as well. So that was my reflection about your comment.
Thanks, Dasha. We can hear you now. We'll take another one. Hiba at the back. You've been able to join us.
Hi everyone, thank you all for a really wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask, with the new anti-obesity medications, and we're already now available, and we're already seeing that anecdotally they're potentially helping with urges to eat and binge eating, but also potentially already being misused and being named at the Oscars and being used for cosmetic reasons. So this is, I think, causing another area of potential contention between the fields, but potentially an area where we can also work together. So I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts on that sort of new area that we're now needing to navigate.
Yeah.
Laura, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, and I think that whilst you say they're available, the reality is that they're not available, and certainly not in Northern Ireland and not via the health service. So it's a very selected group of individuals who may or may not even have the finance to pay for those privately, and then get into all kinds of difficulties around money and so on if they do seek that route. But that's because people are really, in their own words, often saying they're desperate. They want something. They hear about these things, they read about them. I mean, one lady I work with lived experience said she went straight to the doctor when she heard about them and started saying, "Can you please prescribe this for me?" And the doctor was saying, "Well, I can't, because here we can't prescribe it unless you have diabetes and whatever." And then so patients are saying, "Okay, so do I need to get diabetes before?" And the reality is the doctor was kind of speechless, because that is the reality of our current system and our current structure. I think on a positive note, they do offer some hope, but they certainly, as we all know, I hope, are not a silver bullet. They're not the single answer. They also need to come in conjunction with this psychological kind of support and transformation, as well as behavioural support, for those kind of health related behaviours as well. It's all connected. I don't think we can disentangle any of it, to be honest.
Did anybody else want to come back on that? No. So we'll take the other question at the end.
Okay, I'm from Brazil. I ask my thank you for all of it. My question is about the groups. I don't know if you have some experience with groups like animals or kind of that, like health groups. And if we have data about that, because I work at a federal university with bariatric group and pregnancy, and we use all the kind of indicators that you talk about, but sometimes we have a problem to divide these groups by age, by disease, by psychiatric disease, and we are thinking about simplifying, because Brazil is too big and we have a paradox with food, that hungry and obesity is very it's committing everybody. So we need to think about simplify and not simplify without lose our all these scientific thoughts that we talk here. So I don't know, with Dasha and Emma, what do you think about something like a group that people can come and have a structure help, like online and like a hybrid group. Do you know if we have specific data about that? If you can do that, maybe, I don't know, yes or not, but we need to Brazil, I'm thinking like a country, something like a simple, not scientific simple, because it's not simple, but simple to do that, simple to work. I don't know your ideas about that.
So is the question about sort of almost like peer support groups?
Yeah, like health groups, like anonymous alcoholic anonymous that we have. And this is very effective for alcoholism, but obesity is not like alcoholism. It's different, but sometimes we are thinking about that in a simple strategy that could be global. I don't know, but
so I suspect that Ken might have some thoughts about support groups for obesity.
Data, I don't know, because I'm a endocrinologist, so I don't know.
So in the UK, we've got a very successful model of peer support. I think probably given the time, I'll catch up with you after this session, tell you about that. But there are also people who find 12-step fellowships like Overeaters Anonymous work for them. Not everyone, but a small percentage of people. And my view is if it works for you and it's not harmful, that's okay.
Okay.
We actually do run an online group program.
which is currently being translated into Spanish and Portuguese, so maybe we can speak later. But yes, absolutely, peer support, we've done research on that, and it's the group support that is really helpful for clients, so not just having them isolated in one-to-one. And some people genuinely prefer to work in groups, and I certainly think that that would be something that would be very welcome for people, and to normalise being in a group and getting the support that they need. Something that we noticed on Facebook and on our social channels is that the engagement is very low, and that's because people will not want to be seen by their friends or their peers that they are commenting, or but we call, and we're not being disrespectful in any way when we say this, we call a lot of our followers lurkers. They follow us, they watch all the videos, they read all the posts, and I would recognise their names from signing up to things like free challenges or email lists. And then eventually they will pick up the phone or they will send in an email and they will come into treatment, but it takes them a long time because of the stigma. So that is something that I think would be very helpful if we had something like, I mean, people would actually go to an Alcoholics Anonymous group more quickly than they go to a support group. That's the truth. So yes, I love that idea, and would love to have a chat with you later.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I would like that.
One final question then, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'm Michael from Poland. I'm a student at Medical University of Silesia. And first of all, thank you for this session. It was really interesting. Thank you for the stories and contributing that. And my question is about intellectual disability, because as you know, for example, in Down syndrome, which is the most common cause of intellectual disability, towards the obesity is highly prevalent. And how do, maybe it's like a general question, how do we address that? How do we work with people with intellectual disability? Is it different, or are there any special approaches? And it's also I'm interested in that because we came here with a poster about Bardet-Biedl syndrome. And it's also a problem for those children because they do not feel satiety, and also have an intellectual disability, which is really common in the syndrome. So how do we work with those patients?
Okay. Can I just repeat the question for our colleagues online? The question is about special support.
I actually heard that one.
Okay.
Much clearer, thank you. The question is about managing obesity in the context of intellectual disability, is that right?
That's correct.
If I may, I mean, I have some.
Anyway, assuming it was, this is an indirect question. I wouldn't say it's particularly my area of expertise, and others may want to chip in. But my colleague, Tony Goldstone, is an expert in Prader-Willi syndrome, where I think some similarities may overlap with I think you were talking about Down syndrome as a particularly high-risk group. He's just been studying the difference in outcomes around weight, BMI specifically, depending on the care context in which those people are living. And in a brief nutshell, environments that understand the importance of food security, in other words, people with a high appetite, such as those with Prader-Willi syndrome, knowing where their food is coming from in a predictable way, but also limiting access to infinite food, had significantly better outcomes. In other words, that contexts that were Prader-Willi specific, and where people were trained and understood the needs of people in that with those difficulties. There was a significant difference between those environments and non-specialist environments, and indeed home environments, in the study that he was doing. So the short answer to your question, I think, is whilst you might not be looking at specific individual interventions, psychological interventions, context and behaviour management is everything. And thinking broadly and systemically about what that might look like.
Thanks, Dasha. And Laura, did you have something to add?
Just one final thing very briefly is that some colleagues of mine based at University College London did do an adaptation of a weight management program. So it was called Shape Up LD, and it was Shape Up program is one that was used for kind of adult weight management. It takes a kind of modified cognitive behavioural therapy approach. And then it was adapted very specifically in a research study to work with individuals with learning disabilities. And so it was, I think the key thing from that is that it's got to be co-produced. You need to be thinking about who exactly the resources for, the intervention is for, and working with that group to make sure that it meets their needs. So that piece of research should be published. It was Rebecca Beacon and colleagues who did that at UCL.
So I would like to thank all of our speakers today, and particularly to Dasha and Tracy for joining us remotely, and to Jordan and Louisa for organising this session. And I'd like to thank you all for sticking with us to have some discussion afterwards. And I hope you enjoyed the session. If anybody would like to contribute to the working group we're setting up, do contact me, email, Twitter. Scream at me from across the hall. And we really would like to have a bit more European involvement, particularly as we're a little bit UK Ireland heavy at the moment. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.